Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for thank you so much for joining us today and spending your Friday afternoon with us. I'm Parul Goswami, Senior Program Manager at DataLEADS. On behalf of DataLEADS, I extend a very warm welcome to all the participants and our esteemed speaker to the special webinar on using data for powerful storytelling. Google News Initiative India Training Network, led by DataLEADS, is conducting a series of special webinars for Indian journalists, journalism students, media educators, and bloggers. These monthly webinars have special and unique topics with a common aim to strengthen and support newsrooms and share new tools and learning with journalists and media students. Before talking about the workshop, I want to share about a wonderful network. The Google News Initiative India Training Network is one of the world's biggest and most impactful fact-checking training networks. The network aims to support journalists, media educators across India in their fight against misinformation. Led by DataLEADS, the network has so far trained over 43,000 plus journalists, media educators, journalism students, and fact-checkers across many cities in India, over 850 plus workshops, both held in person and online. Just a little housekeeping. This workshop is conducted in a webinar mode to avoid any disruptions. If you have any questions during the session, please type them in the Q&A chat box on your screen. We will share them with our trainer, and we will get through as many questions as time allows. Very importantly, this session is under the Chatham House rule, which means everyone is free to use the information from the session, but neither the identity of the speaker nor the affiliations will be revealed. I'm so delighted to introduce you all to Dr. Mark Lee Hunter. His career has been divided between investigative journalism, scholarly research, training, and consulting. He is the founding member of the Global Investigative Journalism Network, GIJN. He served as a principal author and editor of Storybased Inquiry, a manual for investigative journalists, the most widely used manual in the history of investigative journalism. He speaks regularly at international journalism conferences, to multinational corporations and to news organizations about finding and using information. Now, without further delay, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Mark Lee Hunter. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you now.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I consider it a great honor to be talking to all you folks. I should tell you something about myself before we get started, okay, which is I'm not a data journalist. Okay, I have been obliged to learn how to work with data journalists and how to do a number of things with data. My specialty is storytelling. Okay, and you know, a number of years ago, I just realized that data was coming up in everything I did. Okay, about 2 decades ago, I did my first investigation where we created a database on the French Parliament. That was a story that I did with my students that won me an IRE award. So naturally, it had a big impression on me. And then later, I developed a very strange reflex. When I came across a story that required data, I immediately got on the phone and called one of my expert friends from the Global Investigative Journalism Network and invited them to participate and to, you know, help me figure out what we had to do and how to improve the stories we could derive from this data. I also have the pleasure of having a partner in Storybased Inquiry Associates named Luc Sengers. He's Dutch, and Luc is what you would call a data expert. So as we go through this stuff, think of it from 2 aspects, okay? If you are not a data expert yourself and you're saying, is this something I need to get into? Well, the minimum you have to do is widen your personal network to include people who are good at this stuff, who are really good, okay, better than me, And the second thing is, you guys are still young, okay? I'm 70 years old. I've been doing this, since the Watergate days, which is, I didn't work on Watergate, but that's what got me into this business. And, I will never be an expert on data. There just isn't time, and there are other things that I have to be doing in the meanwhile. You have that time. Okay, so don't waste it. This is a global trend. It's a very deep trend, and we're going to look at the roots of that trend and how we got to the present place, and then we're going to move into how you use this stuff. So get prepared for a rapid fire introduction to what data journalism means today. Are we ready? I am hearing that the audio is not clear. Can you hear my audio?
Yeah, it's clear. It was a bit in between in some patches, but now it's absolutely fine.
Okay,
Clear now.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, guys, here we go. Okay, I'm going to be putting up a slideshow. Okay, you'll notice that the title of this thing is using mathematical formula. Data plus a story is greater than data alone. And just a few words on why you need data, which I had to find out the hard way. I hope you won't. Okay. First is, it's a very, very rich source. If the data is reliable, you have insight into things that you will not get if you take an anecdotal approach. The second thing is, you can find stuff in that data that nobody has looked at. Now, this applies as well to publicly available data. As with any open source, okay, the fact that it is public does not mean that it's worthless. In investigative journalism, we have the habit of thinking, oh, we have to expose secrets. Well, sometimes a secret is hiding in plain sight. And that's very frequently the case with data. It's just waiting there saying, look at me. And when you look at it, you find some things that you would not otherwise see. I'm going to give you an example of that later. The third thing is, if it's official data or data from an excellent source, a reliable source, it's practically irrefutable. You can't be sued for using data that someone has put into the public sphere themselves. You may be silly enough to insult someone gratuitously, but if you do the job correctly, you become a lot less attackable. And that's a serious consideration at a time when nuisance lawsuits are one of the tools that's used against our movement. Okay. Now, what you see here is a contact list. And for me, this is the type of data that is not a story. Okay, if I ask anybody in this room, do you have a smartphone? You'll probably say yes. If I say, do you have a contact list on the smartphone? You'll say, of course. If I say, can you tell me the first 5 names on that list? The answer is always no. I've asked this question of hundreds of people. So if I ask you, when I show you the first 5 names on your list, can you tell me how you met them? Suddenly, the names become meaningful. There's a story to how you met someone. There's a story to how they ended up on your contact list. And that story has more meaning than a simple stack of data on a page. So keep this in mind, okay? Stories are how you remember facts. A fact by itself is not memorable. A fact that is in a context that leads someplace, that comes from someplace, is memorable. That's just the way our minds work. You are not going to rewire the human mind, and it's not going to be rewired in the course of your lifetimes and careers. So we have to think about what is the story within which the data appears. This is an example of data that is suddenly more meaningful. It's a list of rich people, and you can see how rich they are. If you want to go further, you can see how they got that rich. etc. So a simple list has been transformed into something that tells us about the world we live in, where there are a number of people who are immensely rich. Now, this goes back a long way, okay? The first use of data in a major journalism story that we know of was James Steele and Don Bartlett of the Philadelphia Inquirer, who got together with a great sociologist who cared about journalism named Philippe Meyer. They're all still around. And what they did was they created a database of criminal convictions in the courts in Philadelphia, and they matched those convictions to the race of the people who ended up going to jail. And what they found was that Black defendants were much more likely to get jail sentences, to be convicted and sent to jail, than white defendants, even though the Black defendants came from a minority of the population. This was a tremendous finding. It was a demonstration of systematic bias in a place where, you know, justice was supposed to be blind to things like color, but it wasn't. Bartlett and Steele are still practicing, still finding new stories in data and looking at different kinds of data. Their most recent achievement was a republication of a book called America, What Went Wrong, where they consider huge amounts of economic data to demonstrate how the American system has become increasingly rigged against the middle class. You know, this is something you could not do simply by interviewing people or reading public documents. They followed the data and got that other material, but they began from a top-down view that came from the data. Okay, now data journalism did not move ahead on its own, okay, because it requires an investment of time. There are special skills you have to learn. But a lot of people put a concerted effort into driving this trend, and they now constitute an infrastructure that stretches across the Global Investigative Journalism Network. DataLEADS is part of that, by the way. Okay. The first factor that was driving it was government institutions. And this is a very long trend. Okay. Since the beginnings of investigative journalism in the UK, the United States, and France, at least, those are the ones I know about, the documents generated by government institutions have been a critical source. And some of those documents contain things that can be data-based, that is, archived in a way that enables us to to extract, to set in order, to mine data. Okay, the Freedom of Information Act in the United States was another big step forward. The first version of this law was passed in 1967. And for those of you who are into trivia, please note that between 1967 and 1976, when the law was revised to make it more powerful, it's still less powerful than India's Right to Information Act, by the way. Okay, when the Freedom of Information Act was passed, in the first 7 years that it existed, there were 200,000 requests for government information. Exactly 47 of them came from journalists. In other words, the law existed, but none of us were using it. Hardly any of us were using it. That changed after Watergate. Okay, now, also at the end of the 1970s, investigative reporters and editors came into existence. This was a key forum for the exchange of best practices and for training. And investigative reporters and editors committed to data journalism from the 1980s on, and especially in the 1990s, it became the driver of the organization. Okay, and finally, there's the personal computer. When Bartlett and Steele started using data in 1973, you know, an antique object like the one you see in the lower right-hand corner was what we had to work with. So they had to do everything with mainframes and punch cards. I mean, it was an awful lot of what we politely call scut work. I mean, just, you know, a lot of things you had to do. And now, you know, in the account of the Panama Papers leak, okay, which was originally delivered to journalists at the Süddeutsche Zeitung, they talk about the investment they had to make in computers. They spent 17,000 euros on a very powerful laptop, which enabled them to manage big databases. Now, I've run into this problem as well. I'm going to talk to you about an investigation I did with Greenpeace and some colleagues. And, you know, one of the problems we ran into was that we were using databases that had 1 million entries in the database. My computer could only handle 100,000. So, you know, at the last minute on that story, we had some heavy recalculation to do when we realized that the basic material we were working with could not be read by my puny, weak computer. By the way, I have since invested in a much more powerful computer. And if you're thinking of equipping yourself, get the best thing you can get, okay? All right, some key texts in this movement. Precision Journalism was written by Philip Meyer. It's probably the most influential book in the, let's say it's one of the 5 most influential books in the history of journalism. Published in 1976, still current. Data for Journalists is written by Brant Houston, who at IRE drove an incredible upgrading of their capacity to train people in data journalism. And, you know, Brant is still experimenting, still pushing forward. He's well worth knowing. If you need one text about how to do this, this might be the one. Brant also wrote A History of Data Journalism, where I learned, among other things, that many of the people I've known for years were among his trainers. They didn't brag about it, which, by the way, is one of the charms of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. People don't brag a lot. They just pay attention to what each other is doing. And then Journalism Through RTI by Shyamlal Yadav. Shyamlal is a friend, and I'm a strong supporter of Shyamlal. And his work on freedom of information, right to information in India is a landmark. He's still young, he's still producing. If you are not following this guy's work in the India Express, I think you're making a mistake. Okay, this guy is a major, major figure, and you know, you should know what he's up to if you're serious about going into this business. Now, let's take a look at what we mean by a story. Because if we're talking about data for stories, it's a good idea to understand exactly what frame it has to go into. A story is a sequence of events that lead to a meaning. It's not enough just to demonstrate facts, even demonstrate a sequence of facts. We need to know what they add up to. What are they trying to tell us? What does this mean for how we're going to live and what we have to do next? The author of that definition, by the way, is a guy named Itzhak Rowe. I always urge journalists to spend some time studying narrative and storytelling, as well as things like data. You know, when you understand how these things work and have worked for thousands of years now and still work in largely the same ways, it makes you more powerful. And journalism is a power game. There's no getting away from it. One of the reasons we go for data is that it makes us more powerful. Okay. Now, Paul Lashmar, a wonderful English journalist and scholar, made a list of stories that can be strengthened by data. One of them is, how big is the problem? You know, Shyamlal did a wonderful story called Rivers of Filth. It was one of his great early stories. And he demonstrated that despite laws, environmental laws in India, India's major rivers were getting dirtier and dirtier. I mean, it was on a scale that no one had imagined. That was one of the key findings of that story. A second thing is it increasing or decreasing? Are things getting better or worse? Now, you may start a story thinking, oh, I'm going to show that, we have a problem here that has to be addressed because it's just getting worse all the time. Well, maybe it's not. And if it's not, that's a story too. Who's the best? These are more novelty stories or popular stories, if you will. But doing them means that you're getting better at the practice of using data. Is there inequality in areas where there should be equality? Okay, that's the exact category into which Bartlett and Steele's groundbreaking story fit. And finally, is one thing influenced by another? And that will be the category into which the story I'm going to discuss with you in detail goes. Now, here's where we segue into storytelling. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the story-based inquiry method because it's transcultural, it's being used all over the world, and I'm not sure I'd call it an innovation. It was more like figuring out how we were actually working as opposed to the way we thought we were working. We always thought that what we did was we gathered information and then we looked at the information to see what the story is. But that's not what we really do. What we always do is we start with a hypothesis. We think something is happening. And using a hypothesis means that instead of just gathering huge amounts of stuff and trying to figure out if it has a meaning, we are imagining the meaning of what that material is, and then we're verifying it. It's much easier to verify something than to look for something that you don't know exists, okay? Verification is something that we're all pretty good at. The second thing is a timeline. We put the events in a chronological sequence. At the OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, one of the ways they use this principle is to create a database in which financial filings are ranked chronologically. And what that enables is that at a glance, they can see who is creating companies, where they're creating them, what the resources of the companies are, etc. For working on things like money laundering, having that chronological sequence is a tremendous advantage. A third involved in the story. And then we can select people from that source map who either have resources we need and are willing to become sources, or who are targets, whom we can investigate in greater detail with special attention. And finally, we pull that together into a master file that is like an intermediate step toward writing the final story. Instead of trying to go through everything you've compiled, you already put it in order. You structure the information, and then you essentially rewrite what you found. Now, the hypothesis is, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is fine with me, okay, is a provisional story that explains the available evidence. Now, I really love that definition, not because I'm a scientist, but because it corresponds to the way I work. I start with an idea, and I say to myself, I could be wrong. Maybe this isn't the idea. Maybe it's going to change when I find out more. Maybe it's going to turn around completely and become something else. But what that provisional story does is enable me to get started and to look in a focused way. We'll see more of that in a moment as well. The way you write a hypothesis is not complicated. Ask a question and answer it. Okay, you're looking at what you know, and you're saying, what does this mean? What is the story here? What is the sequence that leads to a meaning? And you answer that question. Your answer is the hypothesis. Now, you need to do more than simply come up with a first answer and then try to prove it at any cost, which is a common mistake. It's a form of bias, in fact. It's called confirmation bias. But if you start with the idea that you could be wrong, you can do some other things. You can say, what's the available data that enables us to verify or strengthen this? I'm working on a story about refugee physicians right now, and we're looking at two different kinds of data. We're looking at data on the places they ended up in the world, but we know that data is incomplete. So then we're going back to the country that they came from, and we're seeing how many of these refugees in a particular profession are still in the country. We have two different data sets that we can compare to get an idea of how many left and where they ended up. We know that this data is incomplete. We know that it has flaws in it, but it's still better than, licking your finger and holding it in the wind. It gives us some data to estimate how big the problem is, and then we can work back from that to the effects on the host countries and the country that the people left from. What kind of conclusion? You're going to be looking at the data and saying, will it support this? Will it get us further toward where we want to go? And the third is, what additional reporting do we need? Okay, that's where your interviews come in. That's where your visual work comes in, your other open sources. What other indications do we have that the conclusions we have drawn from this data are accurate? Okay, it's very, very rare to do an entire investigation that does not have additional reporting in it. The additional reporting may follow the data, or the data may be taken in order to see if our anecdotal or human intelligence work is pointing in the right direction. If there's a contradiction between the two, we have to resolve it. But we can do a lot of this work in advance by seeing what the resources are that we have at our disposal, and then moving forward from that to see how we're going to deal with those particular problems. Okay, so now it's into the case study. This was an investigation about the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU. It is the biggest program in the European Union. It gives out 900 billion euros in subsidies every year to farmers. Without it, the farm sector in the European Union would collapse. Okay, these subsidies are what enable a lot of people to stay on the land. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It's supposed to do two things. One is to support rural development. Now, I live in a rural area. I'm speaking to you from the heart of France, 300 kilometers from Paris. I've got cows in the field next to my house today. They're not there every day, but they are there today. And, support rural development. Well, what does that mean? Could mean jobs, could mean infrastructure. And the second goal is to protect the environment. Now, both of these goals are hypotheses. They're statements of how things are supposed to work. And frequently, when you're investigating any government program, or for that matter, industrial policies by companies, There's a theory about how things are supposed to work, and it may or may not correspond to the reality. So one of the things you can do when you're making a hypothesis is you borrow the official hypothesis, and then you take it apart term by term, or you turn it around. And that's what we did in this case. Okay, so our first hypothesis was the Common Agricultural Policy is harming rural development. The rural areas are getting poorer and are losing population. And this is something I observed. I've lived in this area now for 20 years. So I see people disappearing. I see government services disappearing. I see a lot of things disappearing. That doesn't look like rural development to me. It looks like rural dismemberment. The second hypothesis, okay, the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, is supposed to protect the environment. But what if it is contributing to making the environment more polluted? Now, here again, we have evidence that we can observe over the years. You know, for the last 40 years, the time I've been in France, areas that have intensive livestock raising, like Britannia, as we call it in French, have absolutely polluted their water tables. You can't drink the water in Brittany unless you buy a bottle of it. Okay, you can't give it to babies. You can't give it to people who have certain health problems. You know, so obviously, if CAP funds are subsidizing these farms, then they're not protecting the environment. But how do we measure these claims? How big is the story? Now, I told you I'm not a data whiz, and sometimes I don't think things through right. So our first hypothesis, that the CAP was, you know, harming rural development. Okay, I had the evidence of my eyes, but getting the data was a head breaker. You know, I actually looked like this, you know, emoji some mornings. And the reasons were the following. Okay, we had overall data for farm employment and rural population. But when we tried to tag it to individual companies that were receiving CAP subsidies, we went nuts, okay? Because, you know, we could find the companies, that wasn't a problem. And in principle, the companies are supposed to say how many employees they have. So the idea was we would take the 100 companies that got the most CAP subsidies and see, were they hiring or were they firing? And that would be an interesting indication, a proxy, if you will, for rural development. But the firms didn't always file the data. There were so many holes in the table that at a certain point, we just thought, this isn't gonna work. And, you know, we came up with a couple of piddling stories from it, but, you know, we didn't kill the bear. We didn't have a nice bear skin hanging on the wall or on the floor. Just some little stuff, because the data was impossible to collect and it took a long time to get it. It was basically manual labor. Now, you know, part of the way you learn about this stuff is that you put yourself in uncomfortable situations. For me, any training in data is uncomfortable because I'm such a newbie with it. But there is a group that meets at Mechelen in Belgium every year at the Data Harvest Conference. And there is a working group in that conference, which is consecrated to CAP data. They look at CAP subsidies. And, you know, I went to a meeting with them and I said, well, here's what the CAP says it's supposed to do. Here are the two hypotheses we came up with it. And this is the one we're working on. And there was a guy sitting in the room who is a data whiz. His name is Stefan Vermeier. At the time, he was working at Corrective. And Stefan in Germany, okay? And Stefan had just a brilliant idea. He said, okay, I'm going to subsidies pay for intensive livestock farms that drive pollution. Unlike me, because I put myself in the position of having to create a database, which I had already done once with great success. Keep that in mind, folks, okay? Don't try repeating your last success. Sometimes you have to do something different. Stefan did something different, okay? He went for the open data, the data you could have by putting out your hand and grabbing it and bringing it home. And on the European Union level, there's a database that accounts for industrial and agricultural pollution. Oh, it was already there. We don't have to look for the polluters, the big polluters. The EU tells us who they are. The second thing was, at the national level, you get a list of the people who receive CAP subsidies and how much they get. So Stefan, being a whiz, took those two databases and crossed them. He used a technique called a geometric mean. Don't ask me to explain that to you because I can't do it. Stefan can. That's why I called him. And Stefan crossed these databases and came up with a ranking of the biggest polluters who got the biggest subsidies. Suddenly, we have a list of the first people we're going to go talk to, okay? The farmers who are making the environment worse and are getting a lot of money for it. Now, one of the things you have to look at right away is what the data will support. Remember, we talked about that. Now, this was a project for Greenpeace. They paid for the project. We made a contract with them that said, we are going to deliver you a powerful story based on this hypothesis, the hypothesis that livestock producers, intensive livestock producers are getting a lot of money from the EU. But we will only do a story that is supported by the data. Now, Greenpeace wanted us to look at cows because cows are a massive polluting force, at least in Europe. Every cow puts out about 50 liters of excrement a day, and that generates huge amounts of methane. But there's one big problem with that. As we found out when we tried to pursue that part of the story for Greenpeace, the pollution databases don't say anything about methane. Everything is an estimate. You take the number of cows, you multiply it by 50 liters, and that's how much excrement is going into the environment. But we couldn't take it any further than that. So we told Greenpeace, we can't do this. What we can do is pigs and chickens, because pigs and chickens generate ammonia. And ammonia is, it's wonderful for cleaning your house. And around here, we also use it to keep snakes from coming in the garage. But, it's actually counted by the EU. So we had to work on pigs and chickens. And we said to Greenpeace, this is what you get, pigs and chickens. Are you okay with that? And they said, sure. And the subject never came up again. Okay. Now, then we ran into another problem. Because when we began, we didn't know the EU regulations. And it took us a while to realize that we had left something out in the work. This is the other reporting you have to do. What we didn't realize was that CAP subsidies can't be spent on intensive livestock facilities. You can't just take the money from the EU. Okay, you can't apply to the EU and say, oh, I need this money to build an intensive livestock plant. No, they won't do that. What they do is give you money for land. There's a fixed subsidy for every hectare of land. And if you have a big farm, what you can do is take the land subsidies and invest it in intensive livestock farming. And once we realized that, all the pieces clicked. Okay? Because now we knew where the money was flowing through and who was getting it and why certain polluters were so massive, because they had big farms. And when we looked closely at those companies, we found that for many of them, okay, they owned hundreds or thousands of hectares of land, but their intensive livestock farming accounted for 70% of their revenues and profits. Okay, so obviously, this is a big incentive to take that money, and instead of farming the land with it, what you're going to do is put up a stable for, 3,000 or 4,000 pigs and 20,000 chickens. Those are the numbers you're dealing with in this field. Now, then we ran into another problem. Okay, we're looking at this and we're thinking, why are so few farmers on the EU database for pollution? Okay, we know these people are generating a lot of pollution, and we know they're not alone. So why are there only a few? And then we realized that the reporting thresholds for the EU were so high that only the biggest farms appeared. And that led to another hypothesis and to another source of data, which is that farmers are not stupid and they don't like regulation. Who does? I don't particularly love it either. And what they were doing was creating facilities that fell under the pollution reporting thresholds. Okay, if you have less than 4,000 hogs and less than 20,000 chickens, you're not going to be producing enough ammonia to get on that EU database. So we looked at that, and then one of the members of our team, because by now we were working in 8 countries, we had a wonderful team of people that we found through the Global Investigative Journalism Network. And one of them came back and said, do you know that there are data about the smaller farms as well? We can access these forms. Hey, terrific. So we could get another part of the story nailed down, which was regulatory arbitrage. This is a term that I learned in business school. I actually worked in a business school for 20 years in France. Learn a lot of stuff in business schools, guys. Don't rule it out. We also need more media managers, and that's one place they can be trained. But thanks to somebody with sharp eyes on our team, we had a whole new set of data that enabled us to demonstrate that the EU was completely incapable of saying what the true extent of these problems were. We could point to this whole population that fell under the regulations and that were building those regulations into their facilities. It was a wonderful breakthrough, and we were very happy about that. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that a timeline is very important in a story. And there are 2 reasons. One is you need conditions or causes to produce any phenomenon. Some things have to fall into place before the phenomenon can occur. Now, this example of regulatory arbitrage is a perfect example. Why are people building more but slightly smaller intensive farming facilities? Because the regulations came in and offered them that opportunity. Okay, and then afterwards, after the phenomenon takes place, what's the reaction? Now, there were 2 reactions that we were able to find, 2 very important ones. One is that the multiplication of these intensive farming operations meant that Europe was producing 30% more meat than it could consume. What happened to the rest? They didn't burn it. They sold it abroad. Okay, so the meat leaves Europe, but the excrement and the pollution remains. In economic terms, this is called an externality. Okay. I think that point has been demonstrated. Causes, the event, consequences. And a timeline automatically gives you a dramatic structure for the story. Because, a beginning, a middle, and an end, as Aristotle said, our minds work that way. So as we are documenting the hypothesis, as we're mining the data, we are constructing a sequence of events. Of course, the last event in the sequence should be a better future. We have to think about that too. What's going to be the solution to this? But meanwhile, we're documenting how things go. There are 3 questions you have to ask to turn your hypothesis into a timeline. The first is what caused it. The second is what happened in parallel. What's going on around the edges? Okay, for example, with pollution, when we looked at the data for ammonia pollution, which generates nitrates, et cetera, in Brittany, we realized that there had been serious efforts made to control this stuff. And for 20 years, those efforts worked, and then they failed. Then the pollution remained at a high level, and they couldn't get it down anymore. So obviously, one of the questions we had was, why did this happen? And when we spoke with people who, spend their lives studying agricultural pollution, what they said to us was, there were certain measures that were effective to make some reductions, and now they have reached the limit of their effectiveness. Oh, that's interesting. So if nothing changes, we're going to have this stuff in our water for the rest of our lives and the lives of our children. Interesting. And what were the consequences? What caused, what happened in parallel, and what were the consequences? And as you are gathering your material, as you are mining the data, put it in that order. That's going to save you a lot of time when you write the story. And in between, you're going to understand the story a lot better. Okay? And of course, we have to think about human intelligence, This is me about, 30 or 40 years ago when I was young and tender. And I would call people up and say, what's happening? Or in this case, are you dirty? These are monkey questions. Okay, this is a monkey mind at work, just operating off reflexes. And the reflexes, I'm helpless. So when we approached the farmers here, we didn't ask a monkey question. We said, hi, we're working on an investigation with Greenpeace. We have independent control. They don't tell us what to say. We know that you have a lot of animals, and we know that this causes a pollution problem. And we know that you are heavily regulated and you have to do certain things to control this pollution. How much does it cost you? People speak from pride or pain. That last question, what does it cost you, enables them to answer from either. I'm so proud of what I am doing to control pollution. I am so pained by how much I have to spend and the little result I get for it. And that was the answer we got from the first 10 people on our list, which meant we could go with it. They all said, look, we're spending a lot of money. Look, we're doing the best we can. Look, it is not fun and it's not working. This system does not help us to control this problem. Great. because the ultimate result we wanted on our timeline was a reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, which, by the way, is why I was working with Greenpeace in the first place. I thought it would be fun for a change to work with somebody who could get a reform. Okay, I see that we're already running out of time. It's now 11:20. I'm just going to look at this. Okay. This is the process that I'm recommending to you. You make a hypothesis. This is what you're looking for. You're checking the plausibility through the data. Do the data show us whether or not this is worth our time? Make a timeline and then draw a village of the stakeholders who can give you more information, round out the information you have, and who knows, if you're divinely lucky, they may have data resources of their own that they'll share with you. Okay, so this is what the story looked like when we published the French version. I wrote it in French. I can speak 2 languages. That makes me an unusual American. So I'm proud of that as I am in making these stories. Okay. Don't start on a story until you have the hypothesis, a certain amount of data. You've figured out who the story matters to, and you're going to get some ROI on it, return on investment. And by the way, the first return on investment is your improved data skills. Okay. These are further resources for the teachers in the room. Investigating Sustainable Development is a 10-module package of classes on different aspects of investigative journalism. It's free. Okay, UNESCO ordered it, and it includes a chapter on data and another on RTI. Okay, and the Global Investigative Journalism Casebook includes that wonderful story by Shyam Lal that I talked to you about before, and 20 other stories, along with afterwards by the authors that told you how to put them together. These are both teaching and classroom aids, and anyone can read them, okay? There are PowerPoints that demonstrate everything that's going on in the Investigating Sustainable Development. And in the casebook, you can just see how the kind of people you admire do their work. And, you know, for me, it was a thrill to put that thing together and to talk to those guys. I hope it will be for you too. Voila. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Wow, it was such a fascinating and valuable session. We're running short of time, but we'll just take few questions. And Archana Kumari, she's our GNI India Training Network trainer from Jammu. And she's asking, how much can we depend on technical tools for data analysis? I mean, how much reliable they are? I mean, isn't it more important to be data literate ourselves?
Well, I mean, part of data literacy is becoming familiar with the tools. Now, at a high level, people learn coding so that they can apply a certain screen or filter to the data or order it in a certain way, things like this, okay? I can't code. I know people who do. If you have to get into that, you either have to learn it or you have to find someone who knows how to do it and work with them. But I must tell you, okay, the tool that is used more than any other by the data journalists I know, and you know, I think I know the major people in the field, it's Excel. It's Microsoft Excel. And LibreOffice, you know, any of the freeware office suites will handle the stuff as well. So, you know, I'd say the first priority is to get very good with Excel.
Another one is, can you elaborate the element differences in storytelling?
The element of what?
Differences.
How do you mean differences?
I think what he meant, I think he meant, can you elaborate the element
Of looking for
differences in the
differences?
storytelling? Maybe he meant would be differences. I mean, if you're working in a team, then yes, you would have, I mean, as you mentioned, you know, a journalist point of view would be different from, say, somebody, a data analyst.
I see. He meant relationships and differences. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, there are always two questions behind every investigation. One of them is, what's the difference between the promise and the reality? Every failure begins with a promise. Every betrayal begins with a promise. Okay. And a lot of our work is about betrayals. Okay. So that's the first thing we're looking for. Was the money delivered as promised? Did anything get built? Etc. Okay. The relationships have to do with how does one element affect the other? Now, an example of that from the presentation I just gave you is regulatory arbitrage. We have laws that require people to say how much pollution they're producing, but the law has a cutoff. Who falls under that? And what is the relationship between the regulation and the reality? How did the regulation produce this reality? Okay, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. The next one is, why are data storytellers considering AI-driven insights?
Because there's a lot of things we do manually. There's a lot of things we do manually that can be done automatically. I mean, if I had a program that would go through the French company's database, okay, every country has a company's database, and that would look for certain things for me, I might have been able to do that first hypothesis. What made it impossible was having to do it manually. There's not enough time in the life. So if we had something that would do that, wow, I'm all for it.
Yeah. How do we incorporate the real stories behind the numbers without turning our news stories into novellas, since the attention span of our audiences are shrinking?
No, I don't accept that assumption. The attention span of which audience? Okay, look, one of the things I do is research on media. Okay, I've published 2 books about community-based journalism, meaning stuff that is aimed at a particular group of people who really care about a subject. And this Greenpeace story was a perfect example. Okay, now I told you I wrote the French investigation. And Greenpeace thought we were going to get it published in a major French media, a mainstream media. I thought they were wrong. Greenpeace is considered an enemy of the French state. Okay, so these media, which are owned by oligarchs who do business with the state, we're not going to be eager to see this in their pages. They might refer to it, but they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't publish it. And I didn't care about that because I knew that Greenpeace has 3 million paying members and 70 million social media followers. I said, this is a major audience, and Greenpeace is a self-declared news network. One of their 3 strategic pillars is investigative journalism. It's one of the things that reinforces their membership. So that was my core audience. I always knew that this story was going to be noticed first and would be most important to the people who already care about the subject. The general public, what do I know? But 150,000 people downloaded that report from the Greenpeace site. Now think about it. They had to look at the site, see that the report was there, and then take another action in order to obtain it. 150,000 people did that. That doesn't seem like a failure to me. Not in France, okay? In France, that number is bigger than all but 2 of the mainstream newspapers. Okay, so I considered that a success. So when you talk about a shortened attention span, you're basically talking about a distracted general public. They are not worthless. They have a right to know things as well if they will exercise that right and pay attention to your story. But meanwhile, when you make a map of the people who are stakeholders or sources in your story, that is also your core audience.
Yeah.
Okay, and that may be a significant number of people. You can calculate that before you go in. You could say, what is their reach? Who are they influencing? Now, our goal for this story was to obtain a parliamentary reform at the EU. We got it. The EU Parliament was a key audience for that story. EU insiders were a key segment because the story basically attacked their system frontally and said, we need a reform. And, you know, it happened, despite the fact that we didn't have, 65 million French people paying attention to the story. Think about who you want to influence. Don't only think about whether the mass audience cares about what you do. Think about who does care about what you do.
Right. Sorry, we're running out of time. We've got so many more questions, but I guess that's all the time we have.
Okay, I'd just
So,
like to say one thing here, okay? Since there's a question about this, there's a free book on the storybasedinquiry.com website called Power is Everywhere, which theorizes and explores the precise thing we were just talking about, okay, and provides a business model for what we call stakeholder-driven media. This was a big part of my work at INSEAD, this business school. And it's free. If you want to explore that subject, download the book.
good to go. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Markley. It was a fascinating session. So thank you very much. Thank you to all our participants.
We have a request for the
us.
link. I'm just going to put it in here, okay?
Yeah. Thank you to all our participants who've joined us today. We will see you again soon with a new training session with a unique topic and our subject matter experts and trainers. To know more about our future webinars, please follow DataLEADS digital space. We keep posting our future trainings there. Last not the least, please share your feedback with us. It's very important for us. It helps us to improve our future training. So kindly fill your feedbacks and share your feedbacks with us. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.